For decades, Creflo Dollar has been known for composure, control, and confidence, a figure who rarely allows the public to see anything other than certainty in the pulpit. That is why what unfolded at the funeral of DaQuarius Green stunned so many in attendance, and later, so many watching from afar. It was not planned, not polished, and not protected by the familiar rhythms of preaching. It was raw. Witnesses describe a moment where strength gave way to sorrow, where words faltered, and where a man known for authority stood exposed by grief. The room, already heavy with loss, seemed to pause as Dollar struggled to continue, his voice breaking in a way few had ever heard. This was not a sermon. It was not a message crafted for impact. It was a human response to a loss that cut deeper than most realized. Those who knew the relationship between Dollar and Green understood immediately why the moment carried such weight. Green was not just another pastor in the broader ministry world. He represented a generation, a vision, and a future that Dollar had invested in quietly but deeply. Their connection was built not on headlines but on mentorship, shared conversations, and a mutual understanding of the burdens leadership carries behind closed doors. When Green passed, it was not simply the loss of a colleague. It was the loss of someone Dollar believed would carry the work forward long after he was gone. At 72, standing before a grieving congregation, Dollar confronted something every leader eventually must but rarely does publicly: the pain of outliving those you hoped would surpass you. As he began to speak, his words reportedly shifted from formal remembrance to personal reflection. He spoke of promise, of calling, and of the ache that comes when potential is interrupted. Then came the pause. Those seconds stretched uncomfortably long as he tried to regain composure. Some in the room later said it felt as though the air itself thickened. This was the moment when the carefully maintained distance between leader and man disappeared. Dollar's breakdown was not loud or theatrical. It was quiet, restrained, and therefore more devastating. Tears were wiped away quickly, almost apologetically, as if he were aware that this vulnerability was not what people expected from him. Yet that awareness did nothing to stop it. Grief does not negotiate with reputation. What made the moment even more striking was how the congregation responded. There was no shock, no murmuring. Instead, there was recognition. Many in the room had experienced similar losses, the kind that rearrange your sense of time and purpose. Seeing Dollar struggle gave permission for others to feel their own grief more honestly. In that sense, the breakdown became communal rather than isolated. It reminded everyone present that leadership does not exempt anyone from loss. If anything, it compounds it. Dollar eventually continued, but his tone had changed. Gone was the polished cadence. In its place was a softer, more reflective voice, one shaped by the reality that faith does not cancel pain. It helps you survive it. He spoke about legacy not as something you control, but as something you entrust. About how investing in others always carries the risk of loss, but also the responsibility to keep believing in the work even when the outcome breaks your heart. For those listening, it reframed the entire service. The funeral was no longer only about honoring Green's life. It became a meditation on what it means to keep going after loss. News of the moment spread quickly, not because it was sensational, but because it was unexpected. Many who have followed Dollar's ministry for years admitted they had never seen him like that. Some were unsettled, others were moved. Critics and supporters alike found themselves grappling with the same image: a man who has preached faith for a lifetime standing face to face with sorrow that faith did not remove. And yet, there was something profoundly instructive in that image. It challenged the unspoken assumption that spiritual maturity looks like emotional immunity. Dollar's breakdown suggested the opposite. That maturity might mean allowing yourself to feel fully, even when the world is watching. That belief does not require the absence of grief, only the courage to endure it. As the service concluded, many sensed they had witnessed something rare. Not a public collapse, but a private pain briefly made visible. A reminder that even those who lead others through storms are not spared from the rain. In that moment, at 72, Creflo Dollar was not a symbol or a sermon. He was a man mourning someone he loved, standing in the uncomfortable truth that some losses do not resolve neatly. They simply become part of who you are. As the service moved forward, those present began to realize that the moment they had witnessed was larger than grief alone. It exposed the emotional cost of a lifetime spent carrying other people's expectations. For years, Dollar had stood before crowds as a symbol of certainty, a man whose teachings emphasized faith, discipline, and authority. That image had become so familiar that many forgot it was sustained by effort, not immunity. The breakdown at the funeral cracked that image just enough to let something human through, and once it did, it reframed how people interpreted not only that moment, but his entire journey. Several attendees later described how the atmosphere shifted after his pause. There was less formality, less distance. The room seemed to lean in rather than wait to be addressed. In grief, hierarchy dissolves. Titles lose their sharp edges. What remains is shared vulnerability. Dollar's struggle to speak did not weaken his presence. If anything, it deepened it. People listened differently, not for instruction, but for honesty. That distinction matters because instruction can be debated, but honesty disarms. It forces recognition rather than response. As he continued, his reflections turned toward time. Not time as measured in years or accomplishments, but time as relationship. He spoke about conversations that never happened, plans that would now remain unfinished, and the strange guilt that often accompanies survival. Outliving someone you believed would bury you carries its own weight. There is gratitude for breath, but also confusion about purpose. Dollar acknowledged that confusion openly. He did not resolve it. He named it. That naming resonated deeply, especially with older leaders in the room who understood the quiet loneliness that can accompany longevity. The longer you lead, the more funerals you attend. Eventually, those funerals stop being about peers and start being about those you once guided. That transition is rarely discussed, yet it shapes how leaders see their own remaining years. Dollar's words suggested he was feeling that shift in real time. The service became a space where unspoken realities surfaced. Several pastors later said that watching him struggle gave them language for emotions they had long suppressed. In many ministry cultures, strength is measured by steadiness. Tears are interpreted as cracks. Yet here was a man whose entire public identity had been built on steadiness, allowing himself to be seen in pieces. It challenged the idea that composure is the highest virtue. Perhaps presence is. The presence to show up even when you are not whole. The presence to speak even when your voice shakes. That lesson lingered long after the service ended. Outside the sanctuary, conversations unfolded quietly. People spoke in lowered tones, not out of gossip, but out of reverence. They recognized that what they had witnessed was not something to analyze, but something to absorb. For some, it softened long-held perceptions. For others, it complicated them. Dollar has always been a polarizing figure, praised by some and criticized by others. That moment did not erase those divisions, but it did humanize them. Critics who had long viewed him through the lens of doctrine alone were confronted with a man shaped by loss. Supporters who had elevated him as a model of unwavering faith saw that faith coexist with sorrow rather than replace it. Both reactions pointed to the same realization: leadership is more layered than it appears from a distance. As news spread beyond those present, reactions online reflected similar complexity. Clips circulated, stripped of context, inviting quick judgments. Some questioned whether such vulnerability was appropriate in a public setting. Others argued it was overdue. Dollar himself did not address the moment publicly in the days that followed. That silence spoke volumes. It suggested he did not view the breakdown as a statement to be clarified, but as a reality to be lived. Not everything needs explanation. Some moments exist simply because they happened. In a culture obsessed with messaging, that restraint was notable. It allowed the moment to remain what it was, unfiltered and unresolved. Those close to him later hinted that the loss had prompted a season of introspection. When someone you believe in dies before fulfilling their promise, it forces you to reevaluate what success really means. Is it measured by longevity or by impact, by recognition or by relationship? Dollar's grief suggested that for him, the answers were shifting. The legacy he seemed to be grappling with was not his own, but the legacy of those he had mentored. What happens when the people you invest in do not get the time you expected? How do you honor their work without turning them into symbols? These questions hovered in the background, unspoken but felt. The funeral thus became more than a farewell. It became a moment of reckoning, not only for Dollar, but for anyone who has built a life around guiding others. It reminded them that mentorship carries risk. Loving people means accepting that you may one day mourn them. Yet that risk does not invalidate the work, it gives it meaning. Dollar's breakdown, quiet as it was, underscored that truth. It showed that faith does not shield you from pain, but it can give pain a place to exist without destroying you. As attendees left, many described a strange mixture of heaviness and clarity. They were grieving, but they were also reflective. The image of a seasoned leader wrestling with loss lingered. It challenged simplistic narratives about strength and success. It suggested that endurance is not about never breaking, but about continuing even after something inside you has. In that sense, the moment was not a collapse. It was a revelation. A glimpse into the cost of leadership, the price of caring deeply, and the quiet courage it takes to stand in grief without pretending it isn't there. As the days passed after the funeral, the meaning of that moment continued to unfold in ways that few anticipated. What initially appeared as a single instance of grief began to ripple outward. prompting deeper conversations about aging, legacy, and the emotional isolation that often accompanies long-term leadership. For many observers, the image of Dollar struggling to speak lingered because it contradicted a deeply ingrained expectation. Leaders, especially those who have spent decades in public ministry, are often treated as finished products rather than evolving human beings. Their struggles are expected to be resolved, their doubts answered, their emotions disciplined. Seeing a man at 72 still wrestling openly with loss disrupted that assumption. It reminded people that time does not necessarily simplify grief. In some cases, it intensifies it. With each loss, the accumulation grows heavier. Dollar's reaction suggested he was carrying not only the loss of Green, but the weight of many others who had gone before. That accumulation can settle quietly, unnoticed, until a moment cracks it open. Those who have walked similar paths recognize that pattern immediately. The breakdown was not sudden, it was layered. It was the sound of years catching up all at once. Pastors who had served for decades spoke privately about how rarely they are asked how they are doing beyond the surface. Congregations often see leaders as reservoirs rather than people who also need replenishment. The funeral moment exposed that imbalance. It showed what happens when a reservoir runs low, not because of neglect, but because it has been poured out continually. In that sense, the breakdown was not a failure of faith. It was evidence of generosity. You cannot grieve deeply if you have not invested deeply. Dollar's tears testified to the depth of his investment in Green's life and future. That testimony resonated with those who understood that leadership is not merely about vision, but about attachment. And attachment by its nature makes loss unavoidable. As reflections continued, some began questioning the unspoken rules that govern emotional expression in spiritual spaces. Why are certain emotions celebrated while others are managed? Joy is encouraged, anger is often redirected. Grief, especially when expressed by leaders, is treated cautiously. There is a fear that it might undermine confidence or authority. Yet what the funeral revealed was the opposite. Dollar's vulnerability did not diminish his authority in the eyes of many. It reframed it. Authority rooted in humanity feels different from authority rooted in distance. It invites trust rather than compliance. Several attendees later said they felt closer to him after witnessing that moment, not because they admired the pain, but because they recognized themselves in it. That recognition bridged a gap that years of preaching could not. It humanized leadership in a way no planned message ever could. This shift had implications beyond one individual. It prompted broader reflection on how ministry cultures support, or fail to support, their leaders emotionally. Many pastors are trained extensively in doctrine and delivery, but far less in processing grief. They are expected to officiate funerals, comfort families, and provide hope, often without space to process their own losses. Over time, that expectation can create emotional backlog. Dollar's moment brought that backlog into view. It suggested that even the most seasoned leaders need spaces where they are not required to be strong. The absence of such spaces can lead to moments where grief surfaces unexpectedly, in places where it cannot be neatly managed. Rather than viewing that as a weakness, some began to see it as a signal that the structures around leaders may need re-examination. The conversation also touched on the idea of finishing well. In ministry discourse, finishing well is often framed in terms of reputation or doctrinal consistency. Rarely is it framed in terms of emotional honesty. Dollar's breakdown challenged that framing. It suggested that finishing well might include allowing yourself to feel fully, even near the end of a long journey. It might include acknowledging sorrow, rather than rushing to resolution. That idea resonated with older leaders who have felt pressure to maintain an image of unshakable confidence as they age. Aging does not necessarily bring closure. It often brings reflection, regret, gratitude, and grief all at once. Dollar's reaction embodied that complexity. It refused to simplify the experience of longevity. Younger leaders, watching from a distance, took note as well. They saw a future version of leadership that was not invulnerable, but enduring. Endurance, they realized, is not about suppressing emotion, but about carrying it without letting it harden you. The funeral moment offered a glimpse into what that endurance might look like. It was not glamorous. It was quiet, difficult, and deeply human. As discussions continued, some critics attempted to reframe the moment as performative, suggesting that any public display is inevitably shaped by awareness of being seen. Those who were present rejected that interpretation. They spoke of the stillness in the room, the absence of theatrics, the discomfort that lingered rather than resolving neatly. Performance seeks reaction. This moment sought none. It simply existed, and that existence made it powerful. It resisted being packaged. It resisted explanation. In doing so, it reminded observers that not every meaningful moment is meant to be consumed or interpreted. Some are meant to be witnessed and left intact. Dollar's silence afterward reinforced that idea. He did not capitalize on the moment. He did not contextualize it publicly. He let it stand as it was. That restraint preserved its authenticity. It allowed the moment to remain personal even as it became public. In a media environment that often demands follow-up statements and clarifications, that choice was notable. It suggested an understanding that grief does not owe anyone coherence. It unfolds on its own terms. As the weeks went on, the image of that day continued to surface in conversations about leadership, faith, and loss. It became a reference point not because it answered questions, but because it raised them. Questions about how leaders are supported, how grief is processed, and how authenticity is measured. Dollar's breakdown did not provide solutions. It provided permission. Permission to acknowledge that even after decades of service, loss can still bring you to your knees. Permission to admit that faith and sorrow are not opposites, but companions. Permission to lead without pretending you are untouched by what you have lived through. In that sense, the moment at the funeral did more than honor one life lost. It illuminated the inner lives of those who remain, reminding everyone that behind every title is a person still learning how to carry what they love without losing themselves in the process. As the reflections settled and the conversations began to quiet, what remained was a deeper understanding of what that moment truly represented. It was not simply about grief at a funeral, nor was it about a single emotional lapse from a well-known leader. It was about the long arc of a life spent giving, teaching, correcting, and carrying responsibility in public view, and the inevitable moment when the weight of that arc becomes visible. At $72 was standing at an intersection few talk about openly, the space where experience meets limitation, where wisdom meets weariness, and where faith meets the undeniable reality of loss. The breakdown did not negate his decades of teaching. It contextualized them. It reminded people that belief does not insulate a person from sorrow. It equips them to survive it without becoming hardened. That distinction matters, especially in cultures that subtly equate spiritual strength with emotional control. What unfolded challenged that equation. It suggested that control is not the same as wholeness, and that sometimes wholeness requires letting others see where it hurts. The funeral moment also reframed how people think about legacy. Legacy is often discussed in terms of institutions built, sermons preached, or movements led. Rarely is it discussed in terms of relationships formed and losses felt. Yet it was clear that the lost Dollar was mourning was relational, not reputational. He was not grieving influence, he was grieving a person. That kind of grief cannot be manufactured or exaggerated. It arises only where there has been genuine connection. In that sense, the breakdown spoke volumes about the kind of leader he has been behind the scenes, one who invests personally, not just positionally. As people reflected on that reality, many recognized a quiet irony. The moment that exposed Dollar's vulnerability may ultimately strengthen his impact more than years of carefully delivered messages. Not because vulnerability is a strategy, but because it is honest. Honesty builds trust in ways authority alone cannot. For those who had long struggled to reconcile his public persona with their own experiences of pain, the moment provided a bridge. It said without words that grief does not disqualify faith, it deepens it. That realization lingered because it was not taught, it was witnessed. And witnessing changes people differently than instruction does. In the end, the emotional breakdown at the funeral did not redefine Dollar, it revealed him. It revealed a man who has walked long enough to know that some losses never resolve cleanly, that some questions remain unanswered, and that carrying faith does not mean carrying nothing else. It revealed a leader willing, even unintentionally, to let others see that strength and sorrow can coexist without canceling each other out. As the image of that day continues to circulate in memory rather than headlines, its meaning becomes clearer. It was not a moment of collapse, it was a moment of truth. A reminder that even those who have spent a lifetime guiding others through storms are not immune to being caught in one themselves. And perhaps the most powerful lesson in that moment was this: leadership is not proven by how well you hide your pain, but by how honestly you carry it when hiding is no longer possible.